It got incorporated in different ways. In the theatre company that I was working with at the time, when there was a choice at a certain point, when in 1976, when Soweto Uprising started, we had a choice: do we continue with the theatre that we're making, or do we go to the barricade, so to speak? And the answer was we kept on working with the theatre, and some of us spent more or less time at different barricades and made more or less commitment to political action. But I suppose the decision that, for me, I stayed on in the studio, I kept on working, was an important one. Understanding that's where my work and my life was, really. I would not have been a good politician, and an even worse soldier. But I'd been doing drawings, and I'd been doing posters for trade unions, and then at a certain point there was too big a gap between the work I was doing for myself and that work I was doing on behalf of the other. And at a certain point I thought, no, there's bad faith somewhere if they're so different. So I stopped drawing, I gave up being an artist, I left South Africa, came to Paris to study theatre, thinking I would then be an actor, discovered I couldn't be an actor, went back to South Africa, tried to work in film, discovered I couldn't work in the film industry, it was too terrible, and found I was back doing drawings, but very different drawings. Drawings that were done for myself without a sense of how they would fit into the larger struggle inside South Africa. They were a retreat from it into the world of the studio. And it was only when I was there and working in the studio that suddenly the work started having a connection, not just to me, but also to the outside world of South Africa. So it was a kind of a journey from close political involvement to no political involvement to working in the studio to, in a different way, finding a connection. I didn't choose charcoal. Charcoal chose me, in the sense that I tried working with oil paint, and I was a really bad painter in oil. I couldn't get the color, the surface. I was struggling. It was like a bad art student painting. You know how bad art student paintings can be? I was stuck in that mode. And it was a huge relief. And I'd always done drawings, but to understand I would allow myself to do drawings as the form of making images, not just as preparations for painting. And then, so when I started doing the animation, I'd already been making drawings. So it wasn't a new technique of animation, it was simply the same technique of drawing, but allowing the drawings to evolve and develop. Well, the animation is that the fundamental thing about animation is, well, there are two. The one has to do with narrative, that it's a medium which suggests narrative because it's not a frozen moment. Now, a static drawing can allude to narrative, but it's not locked into it. You can see an image and think, well, how did it get there? What happened before? What happened afterwards? And the other is that animation, of its very nature, is about process, about things transforming and progressing. So it's about understanding the world not as fact or as a series of facts, but as something that evolves and changes and proceeds. So understanding the world has got, I would say, 25 frames a second rather than as a fixed photograph, as a series of snapshots. And in that way, temperamentally, when I found animation, it corresponded very closely to the impermanence and provisionality of the world. I think that's why I felt a very good, comfortable mix. I felt that here was a form which in itself, without me doing anything, corresponded to how the world seemed to operate for me. Well, in a very literal sense, you can see that what you do with the animation makes visible what we know but what we cannot see. To explain it, so I have my hand here and I move my hand here. When you look at my hand here, you have to trust on memory, on knowledge that it was once over there. There's nothing in seeing my hand here that says it was there, that time has passed. With the animation, I first draw the hand there, and then I erase it and I redraw it here, but there's a trace of it there, and there's a trace all the way through. So there's something in the paper which tells us something more than we see, which is to say that things appear here, but we've got to understand everything has its history built into it, which becomes invisible in the normal space of the world. And this kind of drawing makes then, in a very literal sense, visible what we know but don't see. So it's as simple as that there's no deeper philosophy inside that. Yeah, I suppose the long-term project of the drawings is trying to not understand, nor necessarily mirror, but go in and out of contact with how it is that we meet the outside world. And when we meet the outside world, it's always a mixture of what the world presents to us and what we know and present onto that image of the world. So in a way, a drawing or a projection is a very direct example of that. You have a projection, like in the nose sections, of these pieces of paper. So you can see, all right, that's a projection of these torn pieces of paper. But from within ourselves, we project onto that, oh, that is a horse. There's the knowledge of what horses are and look like, that when we see those sheets of paper, we don't simply see them as torn paper, which we know they are, but we also cannot stop ourselves saying horse on top of them. And so this is a very direct, clear manifestation. You can see it's paper, you know we see it's horse. But that is how we, whatever we do in the world, we are also not imposing on it, but having this negotiation between what it provides and what we project onto it to make sense of it. And so a drawing or a projection surface are all kind of membranes for where we and the outside world meet. I mean, inside us, it's kind of the back of our retina where an image comes in and it's there, and then our brain translates it, and then we know what it is. And this is just kind of moving that mental process outside and making it kind of obvious to a viewer of the drawings or the films. That's why a lot of the films are about the process of seeing, something that's distorted and which we correct in a mirror. That distorting mirror is kind of a metaphor for what we do all the time. We take, you know, fragments out of a distorted view of that picture, but in our brain we've corrected it to know that that's actually a rectangle that we're seeing at an angle. So those kinds of what we do when we see, but also obviously how we understand fragments of a conversation. You see a clip for 1 minute for a film, and you kind of, your mind is predicting the whole film before and what's going to happen afterwards. Politics is interesting because usually political art claims to be very clear. This is what is to be done. It's Leninist. This is what needs to be done. What is to be done? A, B, C, D, E. The images A, B, C, D, E are the ones we need to make, or the text. But I'm interested in the ambiguities and the contradictions in that. One thing we know is that any claims to certainty always need someone with a big stick behind them to enforce them. And as soon as you take away that big stick, all these certainties become much less clear, and there's much more ambiguity and uncertainty. So it's to say that this ambiguity is part of the political world rather than an avoidance of the political. Can trace different. There's a conventional pattern of modernism which I had as an art student, which goes from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism to Matisse, to an extent Duchamp, but primarily Matisse. And then Matisse at the end of the Second World War somehow goes across the Atlantic to America, where you get Jackson Pollock, and that's kind of the apotheosis. An American color field painting is the natural history, the trajectory of the history of European painting to itself. But so it's a word towards abstraction, it's anti-figurative, it's a whole, but there are other trajectories within modernism. And one of them is what happened to the Russian avant-garde, which sort of also has its roots in symbolism and mysticism and comes out of, you know, different abstractions from Kandinsky. You can get from Kandinsky to Malevich. But it struck me as an area, as a time in which one could say, how did artists, what was that utopian moment when artists thought they could be in sync with a political transformation? And what are the places where that direction of modernism came to an end in the 1920s, whether it was with Neue Sachlichkeit, continued a bit with Beckmann through that, or with the Russian avant-garde in the 1930s in Russia, and in a way going back to try to track, not to try to copy them or to say one can follow from therein, but to note them as kind of not necessary endpoints where still new things can be found. And I mean, I think that's for me one of the things about making art, is that it is a very physical activity. It's not for me sitting at a computer. It's either striding, walking around the room, or physically engaging with a piece of paper, tearing, drawing, erasing. A lot of stalking I mean, that's the Méliès, there's a lot of walking around the studio, gathering, you know, I have a sense, okay, I'm going to draw Soho on the beach, and I might first approach the drawing and say, all right, it's in that shape, let's make the horizon somewhere there so I know the body will fit in. So there's a geographic rough mapping of it. And then there's often a kind of a gathering of energy, which would be by what I would call productive procrastination. Making a cup of coffee, walking around, checking the mail. But in the way it's gathering it up. And then the actual start of the drawing, putting down the grey tone that makes the beach and the sky in a drawing like that, is done with the cloth very quickly, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes. And then the first part of the drawing, with the eraser, pulling out some of the sea, the edge of the horizon, the silhouette of the hill behind, might happen in the next 5 minutes. It's quite quick. It's also very quick. The first of those rough blockings. And then maybe a rough drawing of Soho in his chair, and then redoing it with the cloth, rubbing it out of the cloth, redoing it, trying to get the... I'm very bad at imagining what a chair should look like or the shape. So it would be either with a reference, a photo. Here's a photo of a deck chair I've taken. This is how the pieces fit together, and drawing that in. I might take a photograph of myself sitting in the deck chair. So I've got a reference to see this is the geography, this is how a leg fits over the side of another leg of a chair. Some people can imagine that. I'm very bad at imagining it. I need some clue in the world to see how it's done. And then a mixture. Some sections would then be done quite carefully, with charcoal drawing a bit carefully. And some parts are done very crudely, and then refined, and then the process of erasing and changing and adding will happen. So the first part of the drawing is quick, but it may have taken me an hour to actually get to it. And then the next part may take many hours of erasing, drawing, erasing, drawing, erasing, drawing.